So what we wanted to do today is talk about our physician and APP compensation redesign process, and talk through it in the context of an insight to action framework that we apply across services and service lines here at HSG. And so specifically, getting into and talking about physician and APP compensation, what we'll call provider compensation redesign. We first wanted to kind of start with a problem statement. So we see a lot of organizations that struggle with disparate and singular one-off employed physician contracts with varying parameters and end dates that are not aligned with each other, that are not aligned with organizational goals and objectives. And so we see organizations struggling with tracking and managing the contracts as they create a lot of administrative burden, with again a lot of one-offs and unique contracts and parameters across an organizations with multiple specialties. We've seen organizations with inconsistencies even within specialties, not just across different specialties, but even within specific specialties, having different contracts and structures and parameters. And so that makes negotiating contract renewals every 3 years is very cumbersome. It takes an emotional toll on both the physicians and the administrators involved in that. At times it can be adversarial, and so it is problematic from that perspective. It doesn't really it's not a positive in the culture that you want to have in your organization. So offering contracts to new candidates, can also be a process that's not as streamlined, and not as quick or as fast moving as you'd want it to be. And so the result can be a drawn out process, where you end up with contract language that's often nitpicked and redlined by the candidate or the retained attorneys, and so you again end up with a one-off contract. It often, the not having a standard approach can often engender significant dissatisfaction among the physicians, as their compensation is static across the contract term. We've come into a lot of organizations where on the front end of a compensation redesign process, we hear that people are not happy because they haven't had a raise in 7 years, and it's always the squeaky wheel that gets the grease in those instances, and so people are bothered. They don't like to ask for raises, and so they those that don't ask for it, kind of sit there and stew, and they're not happy about it, but they don't ask, and again, it's the squeaky wheel that gets the grease in those instances, and it doesn't keep up with the market. So there's not a process or a standard for making sure that there are existing physicians are competitive with the market. Sometimes it's the new physicians coming in. Not often are we keeping up with the market for the new physicians, but often we see new physicians coming in, based on new surveys and new data, where the existing physicians are on the same, with the same model, the same rates and amounts that they've always been on. With APPs or advanced practitioners, that tends to add a little bit, further complexity and potential dysfunction, as their employment status is often as exempt employees as opposed to being contracted providers like their physician counterparts. And so compensation models are often, straight salary without any additional incentives, which, is often a dissatisfier for the individual APP. But also from an organizational and a practice perspective, it's less than optimal because it doesn't align, with the physician incentives, or with group, or organizational goals and objectives. And so, taking a step back and looking at the APP compensation model, and designing one, putting one in place that aligns with the physicians, that aligns with how they're utilized and how they practice within their specific practice, as well as aligning with organizational goals and objectives, is always a positive. And so organizations come to us wondering if there's a way, if there's mechanisms, and a process in place out there that's available that can align the physician and APP compensation models and incentives with each other, as well as with organizational goals and objectives, and do so in a flexible manner that can be adjusted over time without the onerous contract negotiations that we talked about. So that tends to be the problem, that's brought to us, that we get involved with. Um, they're also asking if provider compensation models and framework can be developed that are fair and equitable, that they're relatively easy to understand and administer, and then always can support provider recruitment and retention, and then are financially sustainable over time. So those things are always, obviously, important as well. And so our compensation redesign process, is laid out, so that we're working hand in hand with administrative and provider leadership, to craft a model, or models that accomplish these outcomes. So as we kind of get into the process itself, beginning with the data acquisition, and so on the front end, we're obviously wanting to learn as much about the organization and how they compensate their providers currently, as well as giving us the data that we're going to need to redesign, and go through different iterations of parameters and structure. And so we need that background data, on the front end. And so that typically begins with a provider roster. So all the providers, the physicians, and the APPs that are in scope, with all the details in terms of their specialty, their FTE status, whether or not they're full-time, part-time, where they're practicing, and so on. Obviously, total compensation for each provider, for the applicable fiscal or calendar years, with the detail, so that we can see the detailed components that make up total compensation. So, what is base salary? What are productivity incentives or bonuses typically paid out? What are the quality or non-productivity incentive bonuses? And then what's other compensation that's feeding total compensation, as far as medical directorships, call pay, APP supervisory, stipends, and so on. And then we also, will be asking for work RVU production. So what are the work RVUs that are performed and that are produced by each provider that feed into the productivity bonuses and incentives? And then we usually check that versus CPT reports. So we'll ask for a CPT report by provider, that gives us the detail that we'll need so that we can recalculate the RVUs, based on the CPT production, to make sure that the organization, and how they're calculating and reporting and paying based on RVUs, we want to make sure that in itself is accurate. The data request process and analysis will also include looking at, obviously, we want to understand the current contracts. And so, that may entail getting all of the individual contracts, or at least representative contracts for all of the providers. And so that we can see the contract details. Income statements for each practice, quality and operational metrics, so that we understand, what's currently tracked and reported, particularly if they're, included in inequality, current quality incentives or non-productivity incentives. But it also gives us a basis to understand what's possible as we think about new incentive structures for non-productivity, or what some organizations call quality incentives. Terry, anything before I move on to the next section? Anything in there that I've missed or that you want to expound upon?
Thorough as always, Neil. Thanks.
All right, thank you. So as we get into taking the data, so we've collected the data, what are we going to do with it? So taking that data and starting to integrate, to visualize, to analyze the data. So taking that information that we can use to construct tools to construct our analysis. So as I mentioned, the CPT reports, we're going to independently take those and calculate the work RVU credit for each provider's what we believe that it is, and compare that to what's been reported by the organization, to validate the accuracy of the work RVU production. A lot of times that what we'll find in there, not in every situation, but often, we see issues in the way that modifiers are or aren't applied to the CPT production in the work RVU calculation. A lot of organizations don't adjust appropriately for modifiers, and that can have a positive or negative impact on the level of work RVU production, depending on the modifier. We also see some issues with work RVU attribution. Is it truly personally performed? And so how those work RVUs are attributed to the providers, particularly when we think about physicians and APPs kind of working together as a team, who's getting appropriate credit for those work RVUs. And then again, as I mentioned, the reported quality and operational metrics, help us understand what's currently possible in terms of metrics and incentives and targets in those areas that we could start to use in a non-productivity incentive in a redesigned model. And then the contract details, give us the foundation for developing our recommendations for a standardized evergreen employment agreement for the client to consider and use. And so we'll use those details to develop a new contract template. And so as we start thinking about taking that data and starting to utilize that for our compensation redesign process, in terms of how we're consulting with clients, we typically start with the process and working with the leadership team and selecting, identifying individuals, providers, physicians, and APPs, as well as administrative leadership, to serve on a provider compensation steering committee that will be the kind of the spearhead, the go-to group of people that we'll be working with through the process. And so our role in that process is to provide the steering committee with extensive education regarding the benchmark data, fair market value standards and parameters, potentially, compensation design options at various levels within the different components of the compensation model, what options are possible. And so kind of educating them on those options in terms of pros and cons of each. And then offering guidance based on our experience and expertise, understanding what works well and what doesn't, what's applicable in certain situations and what isn't. And so providing that guidance to the steering committee as we kind of work through the process. And then managing the redesign process, kind of keeping, everybody focused on the desired outcomes. So our team analyzes and transforms the data, through the process. So we'll use the data to predict the impact of the changes on individual providers and the organization's budget. So kind of using that data to do our financial projections of what the impact is going to be, and that goes on throughout the process. As we think about this in terms of packaging, so the process usually starts again, as we kind of talked about, with the data discovery phase that's focused on the data, but also focused on understanding the culture, some of the concerns that both administratives and provider leadership have about compensation and the process in general. And so we do that through a broad survey that goes out to all the affected providers as well as associated management. And so we do a survey kind of collecting input and impressions that we'll share with everyone through the process. We'll do one-on-one interviews with key stakeholders, particularly the steering committee members. And then that provides us with some information that is helpful through the process, so that we kind of understand some of the concerns and some of the challenges, some of the barriers that are potentially there. And then we'll feed that back to the organization as we go through the process, so that everybody kind of has, kind of level set and has, an understanding of what some of the concerns are. As we get into the development phase, again, that's working with the established provider compensation steering committee, which can either be an ad hoc committee for just this project, or could be a standing committee for long-term utilization as we get together, as they maybe get together in the future and talk about future compensation issues. Such as selecting new metrics for the quality or the non-productivity incentive, could be a potential role for that group of individuals. We convene an initial all provider meeting, so we meet with all of the providers that are going to be affected through the process to make sure that everybody understands the intent of the process, and we can answer any questions that anyone has. We get together with the steering committee for 4 meetings, through the process. So we'll meet with them to kind of go through the different parameters and framework and decision points that we have throughout the process. Each one of those meetings is preceded by an executive call with a designated leadership team to review materials and ensure a common understanding regarding the approach and accuracy of the information that we're going to present. So we meet with the executives before we get together with the physicians and the APPs. So we typically, so the most common framework that we're working with is a base plus incentive model. And so there's pros and cons of various compensation models, but again, we typically see a base plus incentives model that typically consists of four layers. And some applicable or are changing based on the specialty or the situation, but typically, that's the base model that we start from. And that typically consists of a base compensation that would have some risk for reduction if base productivity expectations are not met each year. So that really kind of makes sure that the model doesn't behave like a straight salary. And again, that risk of reduction, may not be applicable in every situation, but for most situations it would be. Um, but again, we'll evaluate that through the process to see what makes sense. Productivity incentive and non-productivity incentive are two other layers that are typically a part of the process, part of the model and the framework. The productivity incentive is potentially one that maybe falls out in certain situations. So if we have providers that essentially cover shifts, so like maybe a hospitalist or maybe urgent care, where maybe productivity is out of their control. So a productivity incentive in those situations may not be appropriate. So that component or that layer may fall out. And then the non-productivity incentive or quality incentive would typically apply in most practices, most specialties, in most situations. And then, other compensation such as, APP collaboration or medical director stipends may also apply with certain providers and in certain situations. As mentioned, the financial modeling occurs throughout the development process, but it reaches a different level, becomes a bit more intense, and becomes much more final as we get to the fourth steering committee meeting. And so the financial modeling that we do based on the parameters that we've developed with the steering committee, that helps us make sure that the intent of the project is being accomplished, that the model is going to be financially sustainable, and then it also provides clarity on which providers are outliers and might need to be dealt with individually. So there may be some providers that we have to do something special for, such as maybe phasing in the model over time, looking at potentially retention bonuses over time, based on the differences perhaps between their current or prior model and the new model. Sometimes some phasing or some different individual consideration needs to be, as part of the process. And lastly, we convene a final fifth steering committee to kind of review the financial modeling and the resulting impact of the proposed model framework and parameters. So we do that with the steering committee to kind of give them an overview of yes, the model works based on our financial modeling, or no, we need to make some adjustments, and here's what we're going to do to make the model work. And then we'll also do a final all provider meeting for all the affected providers, presenting the final plan framework and parameters to everyone, so they understand what the model is going to look like in terms of not specific numbers, but in terms of overall framework and parameters. And then we'll talk about, we just want to make sure that everyone's aware of the project's outcome and promote transparency, but also start to communicate the organization's intent regarding individual meetings that will start to put individual specific numbers in front of individuals, So we'll talk about the schedule for that process, those individual meetings. And then we'll communicate the organization's intent regarding implementation and rollout, including if there's going to be any kind of shadow period. But we'll talk about the process in terms of rolling the redesigned compensation model, rolling that out to everyone. And then lastly, as the development phase, we think this is really critical. Having that standardized employment agreement, as part of the process, and having that as part of the end product of a compensation redesign process, to give that standardization, to give us the ability to have something that is less cumbersome for the providers and for the organization going forward. And so we'll present our revised employment agreement that we've reviewed and that we've worked through with the leadership team, including the organization's legal counsel. And typically that final agreement will consist of a legal body containing all the legal parameters, of the relationship, and then we'll reference exhibits that outline specific specialty and position descriptions with explicit expectations that are specific to that specialty, to that position. And then we'll lay out the compensation framework and parameters. So, the components, how the compensation model is going to live and breathe and change, going forward. Provide the specifics, the overview of the provider benefit structure and package. And the agreement would not contain the specific individual numbers, but those specific numbers would be conveyed through offer letters for new candidates, and then term sheets for existing providers. And then those would be updated periodically, usually on an annual basis, based on the model parameters and framework, and process for annual or periodic update. And so the term sheets would lay out, and the offer letters would lay out the specific numbers. And then again, with delivery, so the part of the deliverables that an organization would receive at the end of the process would be obviously the redesigned compensation model framework and parameters, but also an Excel-based tool that generates the individual term sheets and comparisons. We like to do a side-by-side comparison of where a provider is currently in terms of their compensation. So this year's numbers, for example, or prior year's numbers, for example, and the two kind of compared side by side, so an individual can see, okay, here's what I earned before, and here's what I'm going to earn going forward under the new model. Again, part of the deliverable would be a standardized employment agreement. And then we would also talk about and lay out a plan for updates to the model going forward. So the sample framework. So as we think about the different layers, the 4 different layers, just an example of the components there. And then as I referenced under the deliverables, we also help organizations with the implementation and the ongoing update and monitoring. And so, that involves, potentially meetings with individual providers or specialties. So we can do those individual meetings, participate in those, or at least provide the materials for those meetings that organizations would want to have with individuals or with individual practices. to explain the detailed numbers. We can provide tweaks to the models or adjustments for outliers. So anybody that, as I talked about previously, we would need to maybe make some individuals or specific adjustments or phase in over time. We can work through that with organizations as well. And then, we provide the annual support of updating the models. So, from year to year as the market changes, so updating the components, the values of the model to make sure that it's market relevant and specific for year to year. And then also working with organizations to create new offers within the framework and the parameters of the organization's redesigned compensation structure, as well as helping with revising the non-productivity incentives, metrics, and targets. So that kind of brings us to the end of kind of the overview of our compensation redesign process. There's some additional resources that can be found through our website, some thought leadership that we have around physician and APP compensation. So always feel free to check those out or reach out if you have trouble finding those. We can provide those to you. So we find that organizations find this information helpful.